Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Jim Blanchard. I'm honored and privileged to be chairman of the Meridian International Center. I always say about Meridian that it is where global leaders are. What's my phrase, Stuart? It's where global leaders gather and future leaders are found. That's my slogan, and I've actually forgot it. But we are a leading public diplomacy organization. We do everything from hosting receptions for the various embassies here in town to interfacing with our diplomatic corps around the world, to doing corporate training, to managing for our State Department the International Visitor Program, which is an incredible program which over the years has hosted as young leaders what turned out to be over 180 heads of state and heads of government. A lot of activity. You're going to hear from Stuart Holliday, our CEO. Before I continue these opening remarks, I do want to say Janet and I, my wife who's here, we drove by the cherry blossoms on the tidal basin this morning, and they are in full bloom. And for those of you who are from other countries, you've got a few days to see this. You ought to go there and see it. It's quite remarkable. It was a wonderful gift from Japan back in the early part of the 19th century, or 20th century, early 1900s. And for those of you who are Washingtonians, don't take it for granted. We're going to walk over there on Saturday, but it's one of those things that makes living in Washington quite memorable and beautiful. And it's a beautiful day, and we're delighted you're here for this day. Let me also acknowledge if we have them in the audience, our trustees of Meridian. Raise your hand, because I want to thank you for being here as well and for your support. They are resting this morning, I guess. Let me just say that this U.S. Global Leadership Project is a joint project between Meridian and the Gallup organization, and we want to thank Gallup for hosting this and for their strong support and help. We basically try to measure how the world looks at U.S. global leadership, and we also have a series of annual discussions, high-level discussions and dialogue that we combine with the survey research. We also have a Global Leadership Summit in the fall, where we have, again, a number of leading diplomats and thinkers and scholars and business people to talk about what's going on in the world, what the U.S. role ought to be, and who we ought to be working with and why. Because we obviously need to work with the world in intelligent and thoughtful ways. Here we're going to hear from Gallup on this current survey, which includes more than 150 countries, which represents about 89% of the world's population. And so we hope this data will be helpful. We hope it'll help our leaders understand what drives views of the United States around the world and how we can improve those views. So to start this program, let me just mention too, today we have participation from a number of embassies, and including several ambassadors, and you will hear from two of them during the panel discussion. But I do want to acknowledge we have representatives from the following embassies here today: Belgium, Denmark, El Salvador, Estonia, Fiji, Germany, Greece, Israel, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Kosovo, Libya, Macedonia, Mexico, Moldova, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Poland, Russia, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, South Africa, Suriname, United Kingdom, and Vietnam. So we are delighted that you're here. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Jon Clifton. Jon is he is the current CEO and president of the Gallup organization, and he's also a Meridian trustee. Jon, take it away.
Thank you for those remarks, Governor, and everyone, welcome to Gallup this morning. We wanted to say thank you, first of all, to Meridian for this important partnership. We decided years ago that we would host this really important conference because we did think it was important about how the world viewed America. So we asked the world, in a very simple question, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of the United States in every single country? So what we're going to share with you today is how did we pull this off in so many different countries? The second thing is what's the data? And then the third thing is what's behind it? And then after that we'll have, of course, a very distinguished panel that will go through and explain what's behind these data from their opinion, and also do these data matter? Should countries care about how the general public in other countries feel about them? So let's dive into that. This is the most comprehensive project when it comes to attitudes toward the United States. The coverage that we have to date includes this entire project, the trends that you see today, over 1.5 million interviews in over 163 countries. This is our coverage. You can see that nearly every country from Bhutan to Swaziland to Lesotho all the way to Turkmenistan are filled in. This year we hope to also fill in the entire country for Somalia. In fact, we did our first national representative survey with BBG. We believe it's the first survey ever of Somalia, nationally representative survey of Somalia in its existence. I know that BBG, Bruce Sherman, is here with us today. But this is our coverage. And we went out to all these various countries and said to them, how do you feel about America? Now, this is an interesting point. A lot of times you see a survey online, you'll read about it in the newspaper, and it says that it was done online. So how did we capture the opinions of all these individuals in 163 different countries? We went through a very robust process. It was not just urban samples. So when we went into China, we did not just do Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. So when you look in our methodology document and read that fine print, you will see that most every country in here is a nationally representative survey. And we also didn't just do landline and cell phone, which we did in most of the developed world. But for 80% of the surveys in here, they're face-to-face. So this, for example, is the sampling frame for Cambodia. Those little flags there are what we break up and we call primary sampling units. Many of you are survey experts, but for those of you that are not, we broke up the country into what kind of look like U.S. congressional districts. And then each of one of those areas, we interview 8 to 12 people. Those are 120 PSUs on that particular map. So you can see many of them cluster around Phnom Penh, but for the rest of the map, we actually go out into the hard-to-reach areas in Cambodia. This map, we have one, every single country in the world. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how are you actually capturing these? And I think it's very critical to see. So we took photos of the process. This is one interview happening in Kyrgyzstan. This is someone carrying out this interview, asking a woman who is randomly selected after we built that sampling frame for the country. Then we use a random route procedure and we use a process called a Kish grid once we've randomly selected the house. Then this woman was selected. And we take her through the entire interviewing process. Now you might say, well, if an American was there and took this photo, didn't that bias the results? We threw this interview out. That's for testing purposes. So we have Americans that are there, individuals that are survey experts that are not Americans, but they go to see if the interview is being handled correctly and to get qualitative information to say, do these questions make sense to individuals all over the planet? Again, just another example, this is Costa Rica. This is an actual interview taking place on these questions. This is the length at which we went in order to capture all of this information. Just one last one. By the way, we have a lot of these pictures. This one's Madagascar. There are extreme cultural nuances in order to collect this information in every single country in the world. There are some countries where men cannot interview women. And the challenge with that is we don't know if we're interviewing a woman until after we've knocked on the door. And a man may answer, but we may not interview that particular person after we've taken them through what's called the Kish grid. So that means that we need to come back with a woman interviewer to interview that woman. By the way, if she's not there, we go back 3 times. That can take 3 days. So all the data that's in here, in all these different countries, took about 10 months to collect. So you will see, and we will be asking, depending on the trends that we reveal today, are these data old? The answer is sort of. But again, it's some of the best data and most readily available data in all of these countries in the world. Okay, that's the background. That's how we captured these data. So what are the results? Now, if we look back to the global median in the first 2 years of tracking in 2007 and 2008, if we remember the first two data points, roughly 1/3 of people around the world approved of the job performance and leadership of the United States. We also asked about China's leadership. At that time, the United States had lower approval ratings than China globally. Now, of course, the biggest movement we've seen for any country that we've done tracking for was from 2008 to 29, and we had a 15-point increase. 49% of the world at that time approved of the job performance of our leadership. The analysis may not need to go any further than the fact that we had a change of leadership. So what happened over the next 3 years when we did this tracking? It's very clear that over those 3 years, we saw a decline. Again, much of this is what we'll hear from our panel today on what happened. So this is ready for our big release. We crunched all the data. We found the global median for where the United States is today. Did it get better? Did it get worse? Or did it decline? We got better. 46%. We've almost rebounded to where we were. Now, again, much of this will be for our panel to discuss. And some of these data, arguably some have said that our foreign policy has not been great over the past 12 months. And some might scratch their heads and say, how did that increase? Now, things like what happened with Edward Snowden and the NSA leaks, the data were collected in Europe before those leaks happened. Very important to keep in mind in this analysis. Now, what's behind these data? Let's do a quick regional analysis to see how do various regions feel about America's leadership. The first one we'll look at is the region, this is a top 10 analysis. So the top 10 countries that have the highest favorable and the countries that have the highest disapproval. But the analysis is exactly the same, which is 9 out of the top 10 countries in the world that have the highest approval ratings of America come from Africa. By the way, the second one on there, you'll see there's one country on there that's not from Africa, Kosovo, has the highest approval ratings. When we flip to disapproval ratings, you'll see that Serbia emerges on that list. It's very important to know that within-country policy does matter to these data. So, of course, the United States was one of the first countries to recognize Kosovo's independence. That's probably what's reflected in these data, and it's probably what's reflected in Serbia's data. Here are the top 10 countries that have the highest disapproval ratings of the United States. When you see the Palestinian territories at 80%, keep this in mind. We also ask about how Palestinians feel about Russia, China, Germany, and the European Union. Palestine is this upset with all of them. It's over 67% disapprove of all 5 world powers. So the United States should not feel alone with this top 10 list. Of course, then again, you see Serbia at the end with a majority of people saying that they disapprove of the leadership of the United States. So here's a regional analysis. The first one we'll look at, of course, this should not be a surprise, but the place where the United States gets its highest approval ratings in the world, as we saw from the top 10, is Africa. But there's something to look very closely at this trend. We've dropped back to where we started. Now only 64%, again, we started at 62%, approve of the job performance and leadership of the United States. Not included in here are the disapproval ratings. It is in the report, but they almost perfectly mirror the approval ratings. The next one is the Americas. Again, you can see the bounce that happened when Obama took office, and it's flattened out since. So where did some of the gains happen? Now, a lot of people are wondering about, is our pivot to Asia working? These data suggest that it might be working. 45% now approve of the job performance leadership of the United States. That's the highest point that we've measured since we started this tracking in 2007. And then the last one, Europe, again, very important to keep in mind, data collected before what happened with the NSA leaks and Edward Snowden, but now we're at 40%. Okay, so we thought it'd be interesting to compare the United States to the other global powers that we measure. So we know where the United States stands, but when we ask the United States when we ask the world, how do you feel about China, Russia, the EU, and Germany, where do they stand? Remember, as I mentioned, China was ahead of us in the first 2 years. But today they continue to drop, and they're at 29%. 29% of the approval have high approval ratings of China. For the 7th straight year, the lowest approval ratings of all of these 5 global powers that we monitor is Russia. Only 24%. By the way, again, the disapproval nearly mirrors the approval ratings. EU and Germany, remember last year we were very close, neck and neck with Germany. And it's interesting because we do EU and we do Germany, but it's clear that people have slightly more higher favorable opinions of Germany's leadership than they do of the overall EU. Here's EU at 38%, and slightly higher is Germany at 42%. So the last thing is, there are 3 kind of countries that are mentioned a lot in the news recently. I think we all agree that we've heard a lot about Syria. And of course, a lot of the countries that we've mentioned today have had roles in what's happening in Syria. So how do Syrians feel about those 5 superpowers? Here's the trend on America. When we first started doing this, Syria was almost dead last in the world. Only 4% of Syrians said that they approved of the job performance leadership of the United States. By the way, we are still doing face-to-face interviewing in Syria. Safety is the #1 concern of our interviewers, but when our teams on the ground say we can still do this, then we'll defer to that. And so we are still capturing the opinions, behaviors, thoughts, and how people are doing in Syria. Here's the trend on the United States. 26% now approve the job performance leadership of the United States. So how does that compare with China? How did Syrians feel about Chinese leadership so long ago and now today? Really interesting trend. It was once a majority, and now it's dropped to 20%. So, of course, the next question is, how do they feel about Russia? Again, these were collected last year. That trend has also declined dramatically. 12% now. We'll look quickly at EU and Germany. EU is now back up to 37%, and Germany's just relatively flat, but they are the highest at 42%. Okay, so there's 2 other countries I think we've heard a lot in the news. Iran, we have not been able to do extensive tracking, but we have 3 years of data. And I'm going to move through these trends quickly because they have an interesting parallel. But let's look at the United States. Here's how Iran feels about U.S. leadership. Over the past 3 years, it's improved. But let's keep this in mind. It's improved for all countries. So when you look at China, 18 to 26%. Russia has also slightly improved. The EU has also improved, as has Germany. Iran's feeling better about the leadership of global powers. One last one before we're done. Of course, I'm naming countries that are in the news a lot. How about Ukraine? What country of these 5 did Ukraine have the highest approval ratings of June of last year? By the way, I asked Ambassador Holliday before, and he actually guessed these all exactly correct. So I'm sorry if these are obvious. #1 in the world. So it's not the United States, but that's 34% approve. China is at 28%, but Ukrainians had the highest approval ratings June of last year of Russia, 47%. But this is interesting because it's down from its high of 61%. Again, it's June of last year. So it will be interesting to see where these go from now. Of course, EU and Germany are heavily involved in what's happening in Ukraine right now. So what does their soft power look like? The EU, 37%. Germany is not far behind Russia at 44%. So one last slide. We are very lucky, of course, to have 2 ambassadors here today, the ambassador of Moldova and the ambassador of Nigeria. And we know how those countries feel about the U.S. leadership. So in addition to asking them about, do these metrics matter? Do we care about how the world feels about us? And what's happening behind them? How do we improve them in terms of American leadership? Where does it stand? Moldova ranks 75 out of all the countries we tracked, and they're now at 42%. Nigeria, on the other hand, ranks 32 in the world, and the trend looks almost identical to what's happening at the region at large, and of course has now dropped to 60%. That's our data. Thank you so much for being here, and please welcome Ambassador Holliday.
Thank you, John. While our panel is getting seated, I'd like to make a few remarks to put in context some of the work behind this project. But I'd like to invite Ambassador Montanu of Moldova, Ambassador Adefuye of Nigeria, and my good friend Ambassador Jim Glassman to join us up here on stage. I think it's worth pointing out that over the years, there's been this question of America's role in the world and perceptions of U.S. leadership. What we've seen is there isn't necessarily an assumption that U.S. leadership means one thing to all people. To many Americans, U.S. leadership means strong leadership in national security. To many people around the world, it may be economic assistance or tapping into some sort of pathway for them to have a more hopeful opportunity for a job. So when you're looking at this question of U.S. leadership, the presumption around the world isn't universally that in and of itself is a good thing. That said, when you look at how many people want to immigrate to the United States, and you ask that question over the years, it's always been extraordinarily high. In other words, there's this view of our society as a very, very open and positive place to be, but there are sometimes disagreements with our policies and the role of our government. And there's occasionally confusion about the degree to which the American people are responsible for those policies versus those policies being made perhaps here in Washington without necessarily, a consultative process with the American people. And Governor Blanchard has previously, we've talked about in these meetings, and there's an op-ed today in the Post about how little American students know about the world. And again, we talk about this expectation of American leadership, but we also understand we have a lot of work to do here in the United States to understand what's going on in the world. And having just gotten back from Cairo, which I'll talk a little bit about, I can tell you that there's a lot more understanding of our policy and what we are doing vis-a-vis Egypt in Egypt than there is in the United States. But let's go ahead and kick off our panel. Welcome. Ambassador Adefuye, I'd like to note that Africa has had a relatively high approval of U.S. leadership, and obviously President Obama's election ignited, I think, a sense of appreciation, perhaps, for the connection with Africa. The foundation, of course, was laid, I think, in the Bush administration with a very heavy focus on PEPFAR and on the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But we did see a 10% drop, not to put you on the spot, in Nigeria. Is this just a natural norming of going from an unsustainably high approval rating to sort of a generally, 60% would normally be okay in any context, but it's a drop. What do you attribute the drop to, sir?
Well, let me, well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion.
Absolutely.
And also apologize for the lateness. I thought I knew Washington traffic much better than this. But coming from our residence in Potomac, it wasn't quite easy. But once again, thanks for inviting me. I also want to say that the Nigerians' reaction to U.S. leadership, we should try to put it in perspective. First, Nigeria was a former British colony, and we changed from a British type of constitution to an American type of constitution, which shows the kind of influence the Americans have on Nigeria. And since then, there has been an intense relationship between some of African countries, including Nigeria and the United States, for the simple fact that it changed the type of constitution. You want to understand the country more. But even the approval rating did not start with the high approval rating. Did not start with just the Bush administration for PEPFAR, for which we are very grateful. It has a longer history, right from the time of Jimmy Carter. The kind of approach that Jimmy Carter adopted towards the issue of Southern Africa, he was seen as somebody, the officials who were there. And I remember Andrew Young coming to Nigeria quite a number of times, and that bond had been there. Bill Clinton was very popular in Nigeria, and by the time George Bush did PEPFAR, there was a huge swell in approval rating. I must say that part of the things that we're doing right now with the U.S. is to put pressure on the American authorities to facilitate, put a more fast track the process of the issuance of visas for Nigeria to this place, because there's a huge demand by Nigerians to come to the U.S. And we want to change the period for the non-entry immigrant visa from 2 to 5 years. It was 5 years before. Somebody woke up and made it 2. But all these are because of the kind of relationship that we exist between us. America had an advantage. There was a time we had a brand of scholars, revolutionary scholars, progressive in that, whatever that word means, who tried to assert the neutral nature of Nigerian foreign policy by advocating for some relations with the Eastern world. But then, following the collapse of communism and the rest of it, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it means that one ideology has triumphed over the other.
Part of the non-aligned movement?
Yes, but that trend has reduced now, and there's almost an acceptance of the fact that the American ideology of capitalism, whatever it is, essence of democracy, was much preferable to Nigerians. And so that also raised America's prestige among Nigerians. And so it reached a crescendo when, with President Obama's election, I happened to have come in just after President Obama's election, and there was a coincidence in which my country signed a binational commission agreement with the United States, focusing on 4 key areas. One is governance, transparency, and integrity. The other one is energy and investment. The third one, Niger Delta and regional security, and the fourth one is on food security and agriculture. That has been the framework of our relationship with the U.S. And all these 4 areas seem to coincide with our objectives of Vision 2020, by which, by the year 2020, we hope that Nigeria will become one of the 20 greatest economies in the world. I think we're moving gradually to that. Only last week, global GDP was recalculated, and we are now the largest economy in Africa, overtaking Egypt and South Africa, and we are now the 26th largest economy in the world. And so the relationship with the U.S. kept growing, and our trade volume is now $48 billion with the U.S. We are the largest U.S. trading partner in Africa. We are the 5th largest supplier of crude oil to the U.S. And most of in fact, the latest trend is that most our ministers in the key sectors of our economy are either trained there or live there or have American background. Our Minister of Finance was former managing director of the World Bank. Our Minister of Agriculture was teaching here before.
So, Mr. Ambassador, why would there then be a drop-off?
Yes, there's a drop-off because there was a very, very high expectation. And I must say that I'm telling the U.S. officials when President Obama came on steam. And we thought, there'll be some more attention to Africa. It's not that we are disappointed, because we know that efforts are still being made in that direction. I mean, the jury is still out in Africa, but the administration's concern with Africa. But we expected more. And then when we did not see as much as we expected, not that we did not see enough, because as I said, trade volume has risen almost 200% since I came in here 4 years ago. And as I'm talking now, there are 3 sets of Nigerian delegations here. Chief Justice and the President of the Court of Appeal is here. Some politicians are here to discuss the elections. We have the largest delegation on the World Bank meeting. So it's still very intense. Yep. But then we did not see as much as we expected. But I do know, as a historian, it's not good to rush to judgment. But with Obama's trip to Africa and with Yali, with Power Africa, with all these programs, I'm sure by the time we do it next year, it will have been, the 10% loss will have been regained. So there's a lot in progress.
Mr. Ambassador, you raise a good point, which is that sometimes there's a visit by a U.S. leader or a speech that creates a sense of excitement, but sometimes our policy with respect to trade and investment, it can't move on a dime. It's a slower process. And actually, when you talk about Moldova, Mr. Ambassador, I would like to ask you, Secretary Kerry became the first Secretary of State to visit Moldova in December. You now have a lot of focus on Moldova because of the events in Ukraine. You have a very strong historic tie with Russia, but you also are charting an independent course and have a budding relationship with the United States. How do you think the people of Moldova are viewing, what do they want from the United States today? What are they expecting?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me for this event. And it is always a fascinating effort for everyone to take part in the interpretation of data of Gallup. And Gallup is a great reputation worldwide. And we know that always 50% of the job done is when you collect data. 50% remains with the interpretation. The constellation of the visits of the high-rank officials to Moldova is related to what is happening in Eastern Europe. And Moldova is just a part of the landscape. We are a proud partner of the Eastern Partnership, the policy of the European Union that has a very important role in transforming the region. And Moldova is trying to implement, on the principle more for more reforms domestically, and become more integrated into the communitarian, economical, social, political space of the European Union. For us, this is the strategical course, and it has a very important impact on what is happening in the mindset of the regular citizens, of the political leaders, of the business community. The visits coming from Washington can be interpreted as a signal of support, as a message of support, and also of continuous importance for the United States to look at the transformation and reforms in our part of Europe as a kind of responsibility. A responsibility to make sure that the continent of Europe is secure. It has all the insurances necessary for continuous development, and for the continuous effort to work out all possible solutions for transatlantic ties. Moldova is a pioneer in several areas of Eastern Partnership. This month, by the end of April, we are getting visa-free regime with the European Union. We are the first country of the Eastern Partnership that is receiving this kind of important benefit to the ordinary people. The next stage and the next step is to sign up the association agreement with the European Union. And this will really reframe the narrative of the Republic of Moldova. What I do mean, people look with a great admiration to the achievements in the European Union, and they want to get the same level of quality of life. They want to get the same certainties about their future, about their kids, about the stability of the business environment. And this kind of cooperation and partnership with the European Union is fully supported by the United States. So I think all these visits, and you've mentioned the visit of the Secretary of State in December 2013, but before in 2011, the Vice President Joe Biden visited Moldova. This March, in March 2014, our Prime Minister visited Washington, D.C., and was welcomed at the White House by the Vice President, by the President Barack Obama. In addition to this kind of official protocolar visits, there is a huge and intensive cooperation in the specific fields of great interest to my country. We launched the strategical dialogue with the United States in March, based on three important pillars: energy, trade, and security. Because these are the main fields of vulnerabilities for my country, and in the same time, these are the fields which can be complemented with added energy and political credit, and also mutual or bilateral interest from both sides, from the United States and from Moldova.
Mr. Ambassador, you raise an interesting point when you talk about the Moldovan people viewing the U.S. as supportive of further integration into Europe. I think it became popular over the last decade to look at differences between the EU and the United States. That narrative, there was a pivot to Asia. We are, Europe's going its own way under European leadership, setting their own course. America's going this way. But for a lot of the world, that transatlantic culture and that sort of bond, that's created is really a linchpin for security. And I think that given recent events, that's probably we need to be careful probably to stand with Europe, whether it's with NATO or forging clear policies on what we stand for, because we have these shared values, and obviously that's a very interesting point. Jim Glassman, you've spent a lot of time on this question of U.S. leadership in the world. You ran our nation's public diplomacy operation, brought really, I think, innovative technology into the mix where it really hadn't been. But there's also this question of, if this poll if everything was taken today, and you look around the world, there seems to be a lot of frustration with where do we stand? Where does America stand? And what you hear, and again, as a nonpartisan comment, was, I just got back from Egypt, and they said, well, we didn't really like George Bush, but we always knew exactly what he was going to do. And with President Obama, we're not quite sure anymore. What is it today? I was wondering if you could comment on how we're doing and whether this really matters. Whether our image in the world and our position in the world matters.
Good. Well, good questions, Stuart. And I want to thank Gallup for really a tremendously impressive piece of work, and Meridian for your partnership with them. So I think the big word today, based on these results, is irony. I would be hard-pressed to find too many observers of the U.S. Foreign policy over the last few years who would say that our leadership is stronger than it was years ago. I think it's more hesitant. I think people around the world have less confidence in our leadership. In some sense, we may have abdicated leadership. Maybe that's a very negative word. I think it is the policy of this administration to take a lower profile when it comes to leadership and have multinational organizations lead the way. So you kind of wonder, well, why is our leadership score increasing? And I probably would have to ask Jon this question, but it seems to me that leadership is actually equated in the minds of most of the people who've responded to this poll with kind of general favorability. So I think if you look at general favorability of the United States, it's probably pretty much the same as leadership. I think these numbers are very lumpy. They kind of, in many cases, go all over the place. You see, In Iraq, for example, in 2008, we had 35%. Now we're 23%. In India, we've gone from 31% to 22%. But in Belgium, in 2007, we were 8%, and now we're 57%. I think a lot of it also has to do with the way that people feel about what's going on in their own country. One of the things I've come to believe over time is that while people pay attention to the United States, as we heard earlier, certainly a lot more attention, let's say, to the United States than to many other countries, it's really all about yourself. It's really all about, Egyptians care about Egypt, Moldovans care about Moldova. And so sometimes these figures reflect what they feel about what's going on in their own country. Your other question, Stuart, I think is really important because when I got to the State Department, I found that the default position for people who are working in public diplomacy is to make people like us more. And there's no doubt that making people like us more, that is to say having a high favorability rating, either for leadership or general favorability, that's good. I mean, it's easier to get people to do what you want them to do if they like you than if they don't like you. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is get people to do things that meet the interests of the United States. So we have national interests. We have things we want to do in the world. And frequently, we have to persuade others to go along with us. So, for example, I think an example of a failure of American leadership was our inability to get other countries, including the UK, to support us in taking limited action against a regime that used chemical weapons on its own people. That, to me,
You're talking about Syria.
I am talking about Syria, right, without using Syria's name. So that, to me, is an example of a failure of leadership. I think fairly obvious failure of leadership. So if people like you, and by the way, people in the UK like us. We're up in the 60s in leadership and have been for a long time. But how come? Why didn't they go along with us? And I think the answer is that it's more complicated than just liking you. So we found, for example, that the Jordanians don't like us, like not at all, if you look at the numbers. On the other hand, Jordan has been very, very cooperative in a very high priority of the United States over the last few years, which is fighting terrorism. President Obama used a phrase in his inaugural, and he used it in his speech in Cairo that I think is just absolutely brilliant. And it is mutual interests and mutual respect. And to me, that is what we should try to achieve in public diplomacy and our other interactions with other countries. Because that is ultimately what gets you to be able to persuade other nations to follow your leadership in achieving your national interest objectives.
That's a really good point. I think we often view it like a political election.
Right.
A chicken in every pot.
Right.
You know, we'll go to this country. What do they? How do they view? In a country like Belgium, the idea of a more multilateral America that's going to these institutions and seeking approval for its action. That's probably wildly popular, I would imagine. I mean, right, Mr. Ambassador? It is. In a country like Japan, which depends on a treaty relationship with the United States and is concerned about the idea of America not having flexibility to be a robust security actor in Asia is probably a concern to them. They want to think that the United States, so it depends. And I think what you've said, which is very important, is let's find common interests. Let's figure out where our interests align. Mr. Ambassador.
Also, just
yes.
One other thing. I really think that this word respect is important. And, you know, when I got to the State Department, I had the research people who were really good. I said, why is it people don't really like us very much? And they said there were three reasons. Okay, so one is they don't understand our policies. We haven't explained our policies very well. Number two, they don't like our policies. So actually, if we explained them better, they may dislike us more. So that was So I thought, well, we can do a better job of explaining things, but we're not going to be able to change, in our little public diplomacy world, change the policies. But the third thing was, that they feel we don't respect them. They understand that we have interests, just as Belgium has interests, and Moldova has interests, and Nigeria has interests, and we're going to try to achieve our own interests. That's fair. But if we don't listen to them, even if we go on and proceed toward our own interests, if we don't respect them, then they're not going to like us very much. Mm-hmm. And I really tried, in my small way, to increase this level of respect, and partly through what Stuart was talking about with technology, partly having a kind of a different way of talking to people. But I really do think that both these words, interest and respect, are important.
Yeah. You know, respect is a great word. The other thing you hear is listening. Henry Kissinger used to talk about diplomacy and negotiation and say the very first thing you do is to state your opposing case more articulately than the person you're negotiating with could do. You're putting yourself in their shoes. And then you're beating their argument with logic. And I think what we maybe do in the United States is just start with, okay, here's our case. And in the case of Nigeria, one thing, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to ask you about, you mentioned all this economic activity and these 4 strands of bilateral activity. Sometimes we've seen when we have a free trade agreement and it gets passed, and we think that that's going to be a good thing, but domestically in some of these countries, the free trade agreement is seen as opening up the kind of the fence for American corporations and for American economic interests to come in and sort of upset the order in terms of the sectoral dominance, whether it's services or energy and so forth. Is there any issue there in terms of Nigeria of, okay, we're going to have more economic cooperation with the United States, which I'm imagining is significantly in the energy sector, correct?
Sure.
Do the people of Nigeria feel they're sharing in the economic benefit of that energy sector? Because obviously if the U.S. is helping extract and produce and export Nigerian energy, the people are going to want their standard of living elevated, increased, and they're going to want to look to the U.S. to be a partner in that.
Well, you mentioned the case of energy in particular, and that's one issue that on which the success or otherwise of the regime is being measured, and it's a serious challenge to our economic development. As somebody said, if a country without adequate energy can have a 7% growth annually, you can imagine what it can do when there's insufficient energy in terms of electricity and the rest of it. So when I came in 2010, the mandate from the president was that do the best you can to ensure that there's sufficient FDI, especially from here.
Foreign direct investment.
Foreign direct investment, sorry, into the country. And we came in and pursued that headlong. And we've been reasonably successful. There's so many American companies, GE, Symbion Power, so many of them in Nigeria, helping us to generate and distribute electricity. But the argument you made about whether the people there are feeling involved in it, unfortunately, it applies to a particular country that's competing with the U.S., that's China. They come in there, and that's the reason why the Americans still have the upper hand. They come in there, they bring the smaller, even the cooks, they are stewards from Beijing. The Americans come there, they didn't do that much at all. And they employ the ordinary people. So that allegation applies more to China than to the U.S. And that's giving the U.S. a tremendous advantage. That's apart from the fact that factors of history, logic, identity of constitution, convergence of ideals makes it easier for us to deal more with the U.S. than with China. And also the fact that some Chinese do not seem to have sufficient respect for things we call human rights and the rest of their policy in Zimbabwe and the rest of the continent. So that, in terms of the people feeling their involvement, know that that's not a challenge to the Americans. It's it's quite okay. In fact, we want more and more, and so it's not applicable in terms of America. You don't have American artisans. They have some technicians at some level, but ordinary people are still being employed by the American companies. That's not an issue with us, with America.
It's an interesting point. So when the American corporate presence enters into Nigeria, they're coming with an idea of employing locals, corporate social responsibility, engagement, these kinds of things.
In fact, just let me make the point. In fact, one kind of policy of Nigeria that, and which Americans have, to some extent, respected, is that when the American companies come, they have a local affiliate, a Nigerian company, working in partnership. And it's been working very well.
So that's an opportunity for me to give a shameless plug to our Global Leadership Institute at Meridian, which is helping private sector executives understand how to engage in stakeholder relationships and sustainability programs and these kinds of things. So we're big fans of what you're talking about. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you a question, and really either of you could answer this. Young people, youth. There have been arcs of perception of America. You had the 1960s, where it was very fashionable for young people. You had the events of May in Paris, where people were picking up stones, and it was very, very fashionable to be anti-American. Then you had, in a sense, sort of a resurgence of, at the end of the Cold War and with President Reagan, and sort of a resurgence in standing. You've had these ups and downs, but young people are now increasingly shaping the political future of countries. They're becoming more active. What can the United States do to understand the attitudes of young people? I mean, our culture is everywhere. You can go, turn on a TV in Yemen and watch the Dukes of Hazzard, on television, or Beverly Hillbillies or something. Our culture's everywhere. I mean, I understand in China they're watching House of Cards and they actually think it's real. That's how Washington really works. But how do we need to be thinking about? You talk about irony, Jim. I'm not going to go there, but how do we connect with youth? Either of you, ambassadors.
I mean, you want to start first, then I comment later.
Yeah.
Since I just spoke, you just.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Young generation should have a better role in reshaping the politics everywhere. And in Moldova, this is particularly true because youth has the highest rate of social mobility. They are getting new chances to receive fellowships in different universities. When they return, they are entering into the politics or in the administration, into the business. I just wanted to add to the likability of the argument that was earlier expressed. When we speak or try to answer the question related to the leadership, we do not mean probably the politics. We mean a composite, a kind of synthetical overview of what exactly the United States bring to the countries worldwide. And this is also kind of the American dream is still active in the mindset of several populations. It is also related to the fact that we have high expectations from the United States. Youth can be reached out by respect, by integration, by new chances to interact and to cooperate with youth from the United States. And I think the soft power of the United States should not be neglected and undermined. It has a huge power to transform the compatibility with other nations, and it may even compete with the European soft power.
Ambassador. I think
yes,
so.
I think with regards to the youth are a very important component of Nigeria's population. We have about 170 million people, a population, and about 50% of them are below the age of 30. So we have, and they're becoming very, very vocal on issues. We have this I hope let me just stress that we have there are two almost distinct branches or sets of Nigerians. The southern part, essentially mostly Christian and having a lot of Western education. The northern part, quite a big part of it, still Islamic. But then, even in those areas, the need for Western education, the American type of education, has been quite recognized. The youths are very critical in Nigeria. They complain against certain of the problems we do have, problems of corruption, bad leadership, and all that, and they're very vocal. In the university, they express their views and they influence government action. But then in terms of relationship with the outside world, I always joke that there are two major symbols of American domination of the global economy. The two of them, I always tell my friends, is Coke and CNN. Everywhere in the world, in Nigeria, you find CNN. Everywhere in the world, Coke is being sold. And every Nigerian youth looks forward to coming to the Western world. And when you say Western world, you want to come to America. So in terms of relationship, the effect of the use on the perception of America is still quite positive. And all those who go around to ask for visas to come essentially use. One concrete example, when President Obama launched the Youth African Leaders Initiative, and they designed a program for African youth to come to the U.S., 30% of the applicants are from Nigeria, which shows that, and this is a program meant for all the African countries. So
we actually, some of our staff helped organize that project, and it was a wonderful project. And that brings up a question. When we brought these young entrepreneurs and leaders from Africa, a lot of them almost weren't looking at their own governments as their path, to success. They want to start businesses. They want to do things. They want to do deals. They want to get venture capital. They want to get, a new kind of economy in Africa. And I think that reflects this whole role of government versus, you talked about public diplomacy. It used to be, I know we have Voice of America here, and we have some other media here, but that there were fewer ways to get impressions about America. And now people are using the internet, they're connected. There's a huge array of information available to people around the world. Is it, and it's not controllable, really. I mean, it's out there. Should we be thinking differently about public diplomacy in terms of the amount of resources, we think about that we put into, the government-funded programs versus supporting and giving grants to people around the world who are producing their own content, creating media, independent media, and so forth?
I think that's true. I think the world has the world has changed so that frequently we were, back during the Cold War, we were trying to get into countries that were closed off, and today there are very few countries that are completely closed off. I mean, there's North Korea, and there's not much, and there's Iran. There's not much else.
But even Iran, they're getting stuff.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's amazing the work that the Broadcasting Board of Governors does in Iran. I mean, right here, as we sit here, there's a broadcast every day. I think it's 6 or 7 hours a day, coming from a studio that's not too far away from here into Iran, which lots of people in Iran are watching. But I think your point about the influence of American technology and the American spirit of entrepreneurship that's tremendous. And I don't know in the leadership data whether people answer this question thinking about government or thinking about Coca-Cola or CNN. It's hard for me to know the answer to that question. But I do think that the public diplomacy efforts need to focus much more on, for example, helping people around the world to become better at starting their own businesses. I just saw something yesterday that I was astounded at, that some work that's going on, private sector work, getting into Cuba, teaching Cubans how to start their own businesses. And
Is that?
I think those things have a lot of effect.
Right.
But I also agree with what you said earlier, that it's real hard for government to kind of manage projects like this, because in government we want to have control, and we kind of have to give up control if we say, well, let the private sector handle that.
It's interesting. You when you travel, you hear a frequent when you hand out your business card, they say, "Oh, good, you're a .org, not a .gov."
Oh yeah.
It's okay to take financial support from a .org, but not a .gov, because again, the U.S. government still has this, this perception of.
Right. I didn't know that. It makes sense, and it's good to know. And we actually do have some .orgs in government.
Yeah. Well,
by government.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're talking about, and we're going to open it up to the audience, but just, this is probably why while it's not reflected in the data, the Edward Snowden issue is so damaging, because if we are viewed as, if our technology and our innovation is viewed as one of the drivers of sort of hope and accelerated economic productivity and all these things, and then people believe that somehow or another at the core there's this other agenda, it's extraordinarily difficult for us, and I think we need to regain, it's obviously terrible what Mr. Snowden did, but we need to regain the trust of people, that our focus on that is protecting Americans from harm, and not in sort of moving into the private sector and so forth. So interesting. Thank you, gentlemen. By the way, I think we are remiss in this era of women power in not having a woman on the panel as we've had in the past. I apologize for that, but I would like to offer the first comment question to a woman in the audience to make up for it. It doesn't make up for it, but let's hear from. Do we have a woman ambassador here, or somebody who represents one of our? Mike, last time I checked, you didn't qualify. Let me you can get the second question. Come on, let's hear it. Anybody? I see B Camp back there. She's hiding. Okay, a brave, here we are. We have a question. If you could just please mention where you're from and pose your question.
I'm not an ambassador, but I am a recent graduate from Loyola University in New Orleans, and I work at the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., in the Global Education Program.
Excellent.
So there was discussion about respect. I'm a former teacher and instructor for the Italian language, and I've also had experience working with the Department of Defense education activity overseas. I think the first thing that should be done in regards to forming leadership in our country is to address our youth by telling them, making them aware about historical facts and understanding them, even if not agreeing, but maintaining respect. And I think that's the key word that needs to be reminded in our community, because technology and social media can definitely help us help the U.S. awareness abroad. However, if the youth doesn't know how to use it and respect it, then we have a problem. And those are just my thoughts.
Thank you. So that's a point that we raised, which is, and again, there's an article in the Post today about this. But if Americans can't point to a country on the map, and ultimately members of Congress haven't developed, they haven't maybe served overseas in the military or traveled extensively, how do we get more awareness and education about historical context, other cultures, into our thinking? Because that's going to be very important. Thank you. Mike, and then Governor Blanchard.
I have two questions. I think Jon Clifton might have some view on this. We know from a lot of studies like the Kennedy School study that there is a very low percentage of people who trust leaders. In the United States, it's about 20%, and some European countries similar. Does that have any impact on trust of American leadership when in a country leadership in general is not trusted? That's the first question. Second, do we have any evidence that there's any difference between the views of America from elites and non-elites in a country? In other words, people who are making policy and so on, is there any difference in their view of America than you would get in a general survey?
John, do you want to take a stab? I mean, I could comment, but you go ahead.
First answer to your question is yes. How does that play into overall approval ratings in terms of trust? The answer is definitely yes. We have some qualitative feedback from being in the field in Europe now, and qualitatively we're hearing that what happened with the NSA leaks will damage our approval ratings. Your second question had to do more with how does the leadership's attitude toward the United States, their foreign policy, how does it track with the general population? There's actually a really important white paper that Ben Goldsmith wrote from Australian National University recently based on similar data to what we're asking. So they looked at surveys in 60 countries, asked on, do you think America's foreign policy positively or negatively impacts your country? Yeah. Those views, then they tested on whether the leaders acted on various things, like how they voted in the UNGA, or whether or not they signed BIAs during the time when we were signing up for the ICC, or when the world was signing up for the ICC, or whether they put troops in Iraq. Their answer, which is very academic, it depends on the salience of the issue within the country. So troop deployment in Iraq, that was a huge issue, and the leaders did what was also on the minds of the people. Votes in the UNGA, a completely different story. Not particular issues of high salience within those countries, so the leaders didn't always vote based on what their publics thought. Mm-hmm.
John, I think just back to that first question that Mike was asking about, I think his question was, there seems to be a crisis of leadership in the world where people just don't have faith in leadership in general. And in this case, because America is still the #1 economy and still the global leader, are we catching that? Is there a correlation between people's lack of faith in leaders and lack of faith in the United States? I mean,
well, I guess, like you rightly said, it depends on and foreign policy in terms of attitude to the United States. People who have views on it are essentially mostly students in higher institutions and the elites. And when you ask the extent to which foreign policy affects a country, there may be a particular issue that has affected many Africans. That was the issue of apartheid in South Africa. Because no sooner do you have a student who has a grasp of world politics, knows about apartheid, knows about racism, equality, and the rest of it. That being it, and then we want to know what America thinks about it. And that affected attitude to people. And affected attitude towards political parties here. You only need to brand a party, say, oh, he's apologizing for apartheid, and they just don't like them. Mm-hmm. So that's why you find many young Africans, many elite Africans, typical educated African, is essentially, I'm not saying a percentage, majority educated Africans are in Britain, they support the Labour Party, and here they are pro-Democrats. Because they think roughly that these parties foreign policy affects, they take stand on a particular issue like apartheid. Mm-hmm. And so, but right now, in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, the fact that one of us is president, somebody having to lose his So it influences people's attitude towards what is happening here. It enforces the pro-American tendency in many people, because since if an African American could become president, means or anybody, any youth in Africa can aspire to whatever he wants to become in the world. So that transition is a great credit to America in the eyes of those coming up in Africa, and it's very strong.
I have two quick questions, maybe.
We'll come back.
Start with
Governor.
Jim Glassman, but this year the United States surpassed Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of oil. I'm wondering how you see that affecting our policies. And the second, obviously, we'd be interested in what all of you think we should do going forward with Ukraine, what U.S. policy should try to do.
You want to take the energy question first?
Well, thank you, Governor. It's a great question, and I think we're already seeing, to some extent, part of the impetus behind our withdrawal, as I would call it, from the world, maybe the lack of an imperative that we be involved, especially in the Middle East, but in other oil-producing countries. So I think that's a negative consequence of what you're talking about the United States becoming self-sufficient in oil. I don't like the implications of self-sufficiency in general, I think can be, ironically, again, negative. I think the United States is in the world. We are the leader in the world. We should be the leader in the world. And whatever particular economic circumstances exist, I think that's still a reality. But I think it may give an excuse or a drive for more of a withdrawal from the world, and I don't think that's good.
Ukraine, anybody? Ambassador, I think you're closest to the action. So
well,
maybe
this is not the main reason to have a reflection on Ukraine,
right.
No, only the geography. But just to give my take to the previous question about the trust in leaders, the fact that the trust is low in the United States, for obvious reasons I cannot comment here. But I just wanted to say that sometimes the social and political demands conflict. From a Hofstede's point of view, Moldova is a kind of male-dominated political community, trust in strong leaders. In the same time, we decided deliberately to change the political system in 2000 from a semi-presidential system to a parliamentary system, where the president is appointed by the parliament. Why? Just to cut off the temptation to authoritarian behavior and to do authoritarian decisions. So the population is demanding strong leaders, and we engineered socially and politically a different system. This is why, for instance, we explain why the trust in political institutions and leaders is low in Moldova. But this is for an obvious reason, to democratize the society and make the society more or closer to the European values and to the democratical values. As related to the Ukrainian developments, of course we are very much worried and we are very much concerned. We are beyond the concern, because what is happening in Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine impact directly and the political situation in Moldova and the whole Eastern Europe. The fact that some of the states may break the rules creates chaos. And we have to be united. The United States should cooperate intensively with the European Union and all the allies in order to diminish the potential for further escalation. And that means that multilateral organizations should be consolidated in order to have a stronger role and a stronger voice. We try to diligently manage any kind of reactions from the minorities, from national minorities that may have different strategies. We try to integrate them. We try to give them a chance to be loyal citizens of the Republic of Moldova. And all kind of deliberations related to the fact that some national minorities are in danger should be treated according to the law, according to the regulations, to the Constitution. This is the way to do it. And of course, this critical time, Europe and the United States should be in the same pace, should have a common strategy to diligently manage this jeopardy and these threats to the security in Europe.
Can I just say something? I just think, and I'm sort of playing off some of the comments that have been made earlier, including by the young woman in the back from Loyola University. I used to live in New Orleans and appreciate all the great work that Loyola does, about the education level or involvement of Americans in other parts of the world. I think Americans right now need to pay very close attention to what's happening in the region in which Moldova lives. Moldova is in significant jeopardy. And this is very, very serious what's happening in Ukraine and its neighbors. And we need to pay attention. I would just, on a personal note, just express my solidarity with Moldova and have a great deal of sympathy with the situation that you find yourself in. And I would hope that Americans and people all over the world would pay attention to this. This is serious, what's going on right now.
Yeah, there was I think somebody quantified the amount of airtime, the missing Malaysian jet, which is a tragedy, 200 and some people lost. But the amount of airtime that has been given to that versus the situation in the Crimea, it's something like 20% to 80%. Yeah. And which issue will have meaningful geostrategic consequences over the next coming decades. Ambassador, did you want to even dabble in the Ukraine or no?
I just not quite, except for just to inform that we voted at the UN condemning the Russian move on Ukraine and Crimea for the simple reason that first there is a convergence of principles with the US, and we've always most issues, except for the one on Palestine, we've voted alongside US and the United Nations, and that one we abstained. Simply for principles, for the sake of principles, the Palestinian ambassador is the dean of diplomatic corps in Nigeria, so you cannot do otherwise. But on issues of Crimea, we voted for the simple reason that, based on our history, since we could not go and overtake and take over small countries around us like Niger and Cameroon, the same principle we should say the big power should not browbeat another person and just go over Crimea and take it over. So we voted for the U.S. resolution on that, and we stand by that principle.
So I think the dean of the diplomatic corps in Washington is the ambassador of Djibouti.
Yes.
Does that mean that we need to do what Djibouti wants in our foreign policy if you're voting for your... Yes, sir.
Thank you. Larry Luxner, news editor of the Washington Diplomat. This question is directed to all of you, but mainly, possibly to Mr. Glassman especially. Just a few days ago, the Associated Press published a detailed report about the U.S. Agency for International Development and its establishment of a secret Twitter-like network for citizens of Cuba as part of covert efforts to undermine the Castro regime. And my question, I'm wondering, is how this revelation of this network and its direct financing by the U.S. government might affect the perception of the United States in other countries where USAID might be running similar programs. Thank you.
Well, first of all, the program, you said undermine the government. I'm not sure whether that's the objective of the program or not. I think providing information to people in Cuba who are closed off from the rest of the world. I'm sorry, I forgot Cuba when I mentioned North Korea and Iran. The Cubans do have access to some information, but it's a real shame what's going on there. So I think that in general, the program, as I understand it, is a good one. The question of whether the USAID ought to be involved in it is another matter. And in my view, there are other agencies of government, as well as private organizations, that are much more appropriate to to handle this kind of venture. Let's put it that way. USAID, at least in my experience, is a lot of money. And when we tried, when I was at the State Department, to get some of it for doing things like that,
everybody's always trying to get that money.
We found it very difficult.
Yeah,
so I don't know. I don't think this is their area of expertise, and I also don't. And I also think that the implication of your question is exactly right. You know, this is an organization that's supposed to be providing aid, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to be doing those kinds of activities. But I don't think they're the best agency to do it.
Let's go here in the front and then back to you, sir. Yes. And I think we've got, just for everybody's planning, I think we've got about 5 or so minutes. So,
my name is Dick Rosen. I'm with the Council for a Community of Democracies. A question about those countries which have, excuse me for my voice, that have denied us access, Iran, North Korea, and you've added Cuba. Why shouldn't Russia be considered as well? For 3 reasons. One, all nonprofit, educational, and other organizations in Russia have to register as foreign agents or they can't operate. Yesterday's news said that the American Council, which manages many of our cultural exchange programs, has been barred from participating any longer unless it also registers, presumably as a foreign agent. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has been denied the right to broadcast, as it has been through subsidiaries in Russia. It seems to me, if we're going to assess the problem of public diplomacy, the fact that Russia has joined these other 3 nations in opposition to any information that would deal with the situation has to be taken into consideration. And one other question on oil and gas in the United States. I think it's not an insular producing activity, but it's an external advantage we have in exporting gas, particularly against the use of gas by the Russians against the Ukrainians. And it seems to me that's a long-term operation, of course, but in the long term, we've got a powerful weapon in our hands by our self-sufficiency in oil and gas, which puts us outward rather than inward looking.
thank you very much. Jim, if I may, I believe we have the Russian DCM here. Is he here? A representative from the Russian embassy. Would you care to respond, or, I want to make sure we're a neutral forum here, that you have a chance to comment, if you will, or you can pass, depending on.
Okay.
Pass? Okay.
Like a pass. Okay. So you raised 2 issues that are very dear to my heart. And so, when I was the chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, I had personal, I was personally involved in exactly the issue you're talking about, where we had relationships with private Russian broadcasting stations, which were all aborted very quickly, and there was no doubt why that happened. I think Russia is becoming more and more closed, and it's not the only country. There are more countries around the world that think that they can keep their people away from free access to the internet. Mm-hmm. So I don't think Russia is a closed society in the way that North Korea is, obviously, but it's a very bad trend. And what you say about natural gas, absolutely. It is absurd that this country, with its amazing stores of natural gas now, the result of fantastic technological breakthroughs, is not exporting this gas. It's a shame. And, obviously there's a strategic reason now to do it, but there's a tremendous economic reason to do it. And this administration has not approved, to my knowledge, any new outbound LNG terminals since, I don't know, I think it's been 9 months now. Mm-hmm. And there are dozens of applications that are sitting there.
And it speaks to the importance of our U.S.-Canada relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. To me, it's an insane policy. I don't understand it.
Last question over here, sir. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Marius Tulzanar. I am teaching at Nova Virginia Community College. And,
Nova Community College?
Yes. But with my study on graduate study on public policy, I'm interning at East West Institute. Originally, I'm from Madagascar. I would like to make a little bit of comment about why the drop-in on the approval rating of Madagascar is at 23%.
I'm sorry, you said what country, sir?
Madagascar.
Madagascar.
Oh, Madagascar.
Yes. So I think that's the trend. Madagascar followed the trend of Africa first. But we have to keep in mind during the 2013, since 2009, Madagascar was under, a political crisis. And I think the reason why that's dropping very fast like this is because the population are waiting for the leadership of U.S. to support solving the crisis. Because in 2009, after the coup, U.S. sanctioned Madagascar for suspending the Millennium Challenge Corporation program and the AGOA. So that is an economic impact for the population. But the support on the political, the U.S. was diluted for the international community. So I think that's on the political part. There is no leadership of the U.S., even though that's the community are waiting for the leadership of the U.S. But we have to keep in mind also there is a competition between leadership of France and the U.S. as Madagascar was a French colony. So that's also play in the role of this dropping of the approval rating.
Secretary Kerry, France is our oldest ally, right? So.
Yes, I think that's also the part because U.S. don't want to be in a crisis with the France as an ally. Right. And one of the official U.S. official said that too.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you very much for your input. I'd really like to thank the Gallup organization for their outstanding leadership in helping bring this information to light. It's such a valuable tool. We hope that you will review these findings. I'd like to point out that both Gallup and Meridian have websites, and I'm sure we'll post the report. And if you want to blog or come in and comment, what is our blog address, Monique? Well, you can reach it through meridian.org, and then Gallup is gallup.com. Gallup.com.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to the panel, Jon Clifton, Gallup, everyone for being here. Thank you very much. Have a great day, a great week, a great month, a great year.